evening, everybody, and welcome to the 15th University of Buckingham Great Lives. And tonight, very, very special indeed, we have one of my favourite people on earth, Baroness Valerie Amos, and we're going to be talking about her incredibly diverse career that's taken her from Guyana through to Oxford later this year, and with an extraordinary richness of contribution. If one wants to see what difference a human life can make, I can think of no better example than to look at the life of Valerie. So beginning with your life, born in Guyana, and then moved at some point to South London or North Kent, Bexley Heath. Tell us about that.
Well, Anthony, good evening, and thank you for a great introduction. I'm going to take you with me everywhere I go. Thank you.
You can. Is that a definite offer? I'm up for it.
And actually, today's Windrush Day, so it's a particularly special day for me and lots of people who came from the Caribbean. And it's a day when I remember my parents. Sadly, they're no longer with us. Many of their friends. I remember all those who came from the Caribbean all those years ago with that sense of, optimism, opportunity. And remember, this was the post-war time. Many of those men had fought, alongside colleagues who lived here in England. They fought next to them in the British Armed Forces. So it's a very special day, and I'm very pleased to be able to remember them.
Can you tell us about your own journey across, and why did what happened with the family? What was the thinking yourselves?
Yeah. Well, we came in 1963. My father had come in 1961. My parents were both teachers in Guyana, and they were passionate about education and really wanted the best in terms of educational opportunity for their three children. At that time, Guyana was a British colony. We didn't have a university, and they wanted the prospect of a university education for their children. So we came, we made the huge decision, my father having come in 61, we then followed him 2 years later. It was also a difficult time in Guyana. There were huge tensions between the Afro and Indo-Guyanese communities, and I think my parents were also concerned about that. So the rest of the family, that's myself, my mother, my two siblings, I have one sister, one brother, we followed in 1963, and we settled in what I call suburbs Kent. We settled in Belvedere. Subsequently, we went to Crayford, and I went to school in Bexley Heath, yes.
And the journey over, was that on a steamer all the way? And what was it like when you arrived? Was that your first time abroad?
So we went to Trinidad first. We went by plane, and then we took a flight from Trinidad to Heathrow. I had an uncle, in fact, he's still there in Trinidad, so we spent a couple of nights with him. And of course, we were terribly excited because we had never made a trip like that before. It was a huge deal. And we were very excited to be seeing my father. And to be going such a long way away, it seemed like a fantastic prospect. And I have to tell you, arriving in Heathrow and then making that long journey by car through the suburbs into southeast London, and it was a very grey day. I remember. I don't know if this is because I have that in my head and it wasn't, but I always remember it as a very grey day and what looked like very dark houses and no sunshine, and thinking, wow, I mean, it was so different, because of course I had left a country that was very bright, very colourful, which of course was also extremely diverse. I mean, you know, the two majority ethnic groups in Guyana are the Afro and the Indo-Guyanese, and to come to Britain, it was a very, very different place.
And did you find settling in that people accepted the family and your sister and your brother, and was it as accepting as Guyana?
On the whole, we were welcomed, I have to say. Not always. People weren't always kind. You know, we had the usual stuff in the street, you know, being spat at and so on. Someone tried to get a petition together when my parents tried to buy their first house, but thankfully they didn't get many signatures for it. But one of the more difficult things was what people did almost unconsciously. So wanting to touch our hair and our skin because they had never seen a black person in the flesh. And that was really, really hard, actually, because it wasn't that people were doing it out of any kind of malice. They were doing it to kind of know what we felt like, to know what our hair felt like. But when you are 9, 10, it's a really difficult experience because you can't say to an older person, don't do that. And we had to go through that an awful lot.
So what was it that started making a difference? Was it the legislation by the Harold Wilson government? And how much difference did it make? You went to Bexley Technical College, which I think is now Townley Grammar School for Girls.
School for Girls, actually, which became Townley Grammar for Girls. Yes, I did the 11 plus, passed the 11 plus, and went to. There were two possible schools close to where we lived: Dartford Grammar School and what was then called Bexley Tech, and I went to Bexley Tech.
And well treated by the staff and by the other girls, and you became deputy head girl.
I was the first black girl in the school. My sister was the second, 3 years later. I enjoyed my studies. I was pretty academic. So teachers took to me, particularly my English teacher. I'll always remember her because I loved reading. I loved literature. So I think when that happens to you, when you love particular kinds of subjects, you do get taken under the wing of your teacher. Of course, there were incidents. There always are. Adolescent girls aren't always very kind, but we got through it. And one of the reasons that we came through it is partly because my sister and I both enjoyed other activities. She was very, very sporty. I also enjoyed sport. I didn't particularly enjoy hockey, I have to tell you, but you know, netball, tennis, athletics, I did all of that. And I was involved in the choir, so I did lots of things around just the subjects I was interested in. But also my parents were very, very careful to make sure that we were confident about where we came from, our background, that we were able to speak confidently and authoritatively about that. And I remember an incident at primary school with my sister where they tried to welcome her, and in trying to show welcome, got it completely wrong. So they decided to do an entire class about where Colleen came from. They did it about Ghana instead of Guyana. And they got out some sort of terribly old pictures of people living in huts in Ghana, and of course she was terribly upset because it didn't look remotely like Guyana. But it was also the fact that, as it were, they had picked out the worst bits of Ghana, because even Ghana then at that time, that was very much in the rural areas that you had that. So she came home, she was in tears, we talked it through, and the next day she went and she did her own presentation about Guyana and the country that we had come from. But her teachers thought they were being well-meaning. in doing that.
And the influence of your parents on you, it's obviously hard to sum it up, but what in particular, what attributes in particular did you ingest from them?
Oh, I think confidence. Without them being there and giving us that confidence to speak up and to challenge, I think I would be a very different person. Curiosity. We were always a household where we were looking outwards. We were always encouraged to listen to the news, to challenge things, to ask questions. That was very, very important. And a really strong thread around social justice and equality. And not just in a personal way, not just around issues like race equality, gender equality, but also in the way that things worked in the world, in the relationships that countries had to each other. And it was particularly interesting for me later on in my career when I went to the United Nations, because it was something that I was always thinking about in terms of my childhood.
And then you went on to Warwick and sociology. Explain what was the thinking there?
But it's not quite as straightforward as it seems. I wasn't entirely sure what I wanted to do when I left school. I was interested in so much. So I actually applied for different courses at different universities. I applied to do English literature at one course, I recall. I applied to do sociology at Warwick, but I was fascinated by societies, the way they worked. But also the sociology course at Warwick at that time was doing, there were some very interesting things. They were doing the sociology of developing societies, for example, the sociology of gender, the sociology of race, all things that I was very, very interested in. And that's what attracted me to Warwick.
And now you found yourself in a much more racially diverse educational establishment for the first time. Or was it at the time, Warwick 73, 76?
So it was the first time, for example, that I was able to mix with fellow students from across the African continent, as well as from the Caribbean and from lots of other parts of the world. So yes, it was a more diverse environment, and because Warwick is close to Birmingham, we also would go into Birmingham quite a lot, as well as Coventry. But I think I remember it as being more diverse than it probably was because of the group of friends that I made at Warwick.
And you went on then to Birmingham to postgrad, and you were looking at the journey for Black girls from school into work. What were you beginning to find there, and was that fueling your later thoughts about equal opportunities?
So I went to Birmingham because I wanted to work with Stuart Hall. I went to the Centre for Contemporary Cultural Studies, which Stuart Hall was leading at that time. And of course, he was, you know, the leading sociologist in terms of critical thinking. And in terms of issues around culture. And it was an absolutely fascinating and interesting time to be there. People like Paul Gilroy and Lawrence were there at the same time. And after I finished at Birmingham, I then went on to do some research looking specifically at this transition from school to work, because one of the things that I had seen through some of the academic work that I was doing was that something seemed to happen for young Black girls during that transition, and many actually fell out of the system at that point. They weren't really able to get the kinds of jobs that they were should have got in terms of their educational achievement, and many of them went on to have relationships and went on to have children rather than entering the workforce. And I was very interested in precisely what was happening at that moment that meant they weren't getting the employment opportunities that they should have had. And of course, all of these years later, when you look at what's been happening with Black Lives Matter, when you look at the statistics that still show that terrible discrimination in employment, continuing underachievement in education, overrepresentation in the criminal justice system, we still have figures that all of those years later we should not be having as a society. And I have to say, at that time, my hope was that we would become a much more equal and a much more fair society. A lot has changed, but we still have so much to do.
So you then left university and went to work for local government in Camden and Hackney, and there you were getting a different kind of experience. And this was now Thatcher's Britain, 1980s. Was enough being done for Black males, Black females? Were there lessons being missed that we've later suffered from because we should have been acting earlier?
So what was interesting for me at that time, I started my career in local government as a race relations advisor in Lambeth. I then went on to be a women's advisor in Camden, and then I went on to run training and development in Hackney. And it was that moment in the early 80s when we saw that explosion, as it were, in local government, particularly in London, but also in other parts of the country, when increasingly there was a recognition that the services being provided by local authorities, that they needed to provide them in a different kind of way, that their communities had changed. And if they were going to meet the needs of everyone in those communities, those services needed to be applied differently. And one of the areas in particular was to look around who was actually employed, who got those jobs in local government. And at that time, secure jobs in local government, where, for example, if you looked at some services, there were families who historically had worked in those services, and then their children came into those services and those jobs were passed on. So the system was not fair, and part of what we were trying to do, those of us who were race advisors at that time, was to really bring to the attention of the services that we worked in the nature and level of discrimination, looking at the data, looking at who used those services and why some communities didn't use those services at all. And I worked in what was then called amenity services in Lambeth. It was essentially recreation and leisure services, and included libraries. And of course, part of what we were able to do in the time that I was there was to shift the service provision to make it more appropriate, but also look at who was actually working for that department and begin to change the face of that as well.
So then in 1989, you became, still in your mid-30s, Chief Executive of the Equal Opportunities Commission, a huge appointment, and you were there for 4 and a bit years. How did that appointment come about, and what was your real passion in that job? How much difference did you make?
So it's very interesting that you asked me that, because I was actually headhunted for that role, and the person who was the headhunter was, I have to say, single-minded in her pursuit of me. I hadn't even seen the advertisement when it came out. She rang me up, encouraged me to apply. It was quite a process with a couple of interviews, with tests, which they were using at that time, and eventually it was a job that I got. And I think what I hadn't quite figured out at the time was that I was moving from a role in local government. I was enjoying working in local government. I could see that my career would progress in local government, and I think I didn't quite understand how moving into a national role of major significance in terms of being Chief Executive of the Equal Opportunities Commission. In my mid-30s, I did not understand the impact it would have, and it had huge impact on me in terms of what I learned, but also in terms of understanding that when you're doing that kind of national role, you have to look at new kinds of ways of making an impact in the area that you're working in. And we began to use judicial review and to take the equivalent of class actions to try to bring about change in UK legislation. And I have to say, it was extremely successful. There are things that I'm extremely proud about that time that I'm still proud of today. The fact that part-time workers and full-time workers are now not discriminated against in terms of the employment and the way that they are protected in employment is as a result that was of legislation that was taken at that time when I was Chief Executive. And we had an amazing legal team that were able to see these opportunities, and we took these kinds of cases. The equalisation of the pension age, again, this was something that came about as a result of action taken by the Equal Opportunities Commission at that time.
And by now we had John Major as Prime Minister. Was his government any more sympathetic to equal opportunities than Thatcher, or not?
So I think there's a kind of difficult balance here, because what you have is the Equal Opportunities Commission as what was then called a non-departmental public body, so funded by government but independent of government. And of course, these are organisations that are always a bit of an irritant to government. You know, however sympathetic or unsympathetic a government might be to the objectives of that organisation. And I have to say that I don't think that there was a significant difference at that point. And of course, that was getting very close to the point when I left anyway.
And you went to South Africa, and South Africa at an extraordinary time in 1994 for the next 2 or 3 years, and Nelson Mandela emerging and the white apartheid regime, de Klerk beginning to disappear. What were you doing there? How did that change your life?
It's an incredibly exciting time. So Nelson Mandela comes out of prison. It's possible then to start visiting South Africa, and it was a country that I had always been very interested in. So I went for the first time, I think in late 94 or early 1995. The ANC won the election. Those who are old enough will remember those incredible queues of people waiting to vote. And of course, you had a new government. You had ministers who were very interested in learning from the experiences of other parts of the world, but also wanted to make sure that what they were doing was right for South Africa. And after that first visit, 3 of us formed a consultancy. I was also doing a lot of work at the time for the Commonwealth Secretariat, and essentially was commuting back and forth to South Africa for the next 3 to 4 years. And it was an amazing time. I mean, you know, learning about a country coming out of those apartheid conditions. How do you try to actually change, as it were, every single thing in that country to make sure that what you are doing is working for a majority community, not a minority community? And they had to work on absolutely everything. I was privileged enough to work with the Department of Justice, I also worked with the Human Rights Commission, doing work with them around their strategic direction, and I also worked with the Department of Labour. With the work that I did with the Commonwealth Secretariat around elections, I was able to travel around the whole country as well. So the learning I did at that time is something that has always stayed with me. It's not easy to turn a country around. And the way that they were trying to do it, learning from others, but also recognizing the particularity of the South African experience is something that it was that I was privileged to be able to see.
And Valerie, could you give our students and everyone else a sense about what Nelson Mandela was like close up, and what was his authority and charisma and power?
He was the most extraordinary man. He was somebody who showed such enormous humility. I mean, when you met him, he was exactly the way that he seemed when you saw him, for example, on television. He was very warm, always very welcoming, but also he made you feel when you met him that you were the most special person to him at that point in time. And of course, everyone was overawed to meet him, but he never ever presented in that way. And he was always interested to hear what people were doing. And I have a photograph that was taken with him much later in 2003, when I remember I was speaking to him in South Africa earlier in the year when I visited. I was a minister then. And he said to me that there was something that that our two governments disagreed on. And he didn't agree with me. He said, I don't agree with you, but you are very, very persuasive. You should be in the cabinet. This was early 2003. It was around April. And I was promoted to the cabinet, I think in May that year. And he came to London later in the year, and there's a photograph, which I absolutely treasure, of the two of us laughing out loud, because I whispered in his ear. I said to him, you said I should be in the cabinet. It happened within a month. Have you got any other plans for me?
Is he one of the most influential figures in your life? Would he be in your top 5? Oh,
yes. I mean, my parents are right at the top, but he would certainly be there.
And are they still alive? By now, you're a celebrated national figure. Are your parents still alive to enjoy their daughter's success?
Sadly, my parents are no longer with us, but they did see me get into the House of Lords. They did see me become a leader of the House of Lords. They did see me become a cabinet minister. They were very, very proud of that.
So tell us about the journey to Labour. There's another very charismatic figure. Tony Blair became Labour leader in July 1994, sweeping all before him at the very height of his power, and he brings you into the House of Lords in 1997, and then you become a whip, and then you take over from Claire Short, who resigns after the Iraq War. I mean, a stellar rise up. Are you definitely Labour here, and how did that feel now being a member of government?
So my family has always been Labour. It's a part of my childhood, and I think that, you know, that passion for equality and social justice that I talked about is something that situated us naturally within Labour politics. I think one of the things that attracted me to the Tony Blair Labour Party, as it were, was the fact that Tony very much understood that people could be disadvantaged, but were still aspirational. And it was something that I had very much seen within the Black community. And so much of what the Labour government that I was in was trying to do was to speak to that aspiration in a positive way, whilst at the same time tackling that embedded structural inequality that we saw in our country.
So we're now in the midst of 13 years of Labour government from 1997 to 2010. In general, were Labour doing far more to give BAME people of all ages a much fairer opportunity?
Yes, I think we did, and I think we did that through some general policies that we put into place, but also through some very specific things that we did. And, you know, one of the earlier things, of course, was the Macpherson inquiry, which was so important in terms of, this is in relation to the death of Stephen Lawrence.
Who was killed not that far away from where you were brought up.
That's absolutely
our students on looking at this, Valerie, who won't know about the Stephen Lawrence, or just an outline. Can you fill in that and about the Macpherson report afterwards?
Yeah. So Stephen Lawrence was a young man who grew up much after I did, but in South London, Southeast London, and he was violently attacked and murdered by three. He was with friends walking home and was attacked by three young white men who were not brought to justice for years and years and years. And his mother, Doreen Lawrence, and his father basically waged a campaign to get justice for their son. And you can imagine the emotional toll of all of that. There were then a couple of private prosecutions, and then eventually prosecution of those young men. And it went on for years. And there were huge concerns about the way that the police prosecuted this case, how they dealt with it, how they dealt with the family, what they thought of Stephen and, as a young man, and the friends that he was walking out with. And as a result of all of that, when Labour came into power, a former judge was asked to lead an inquiry, and that's the Macpherson report, which found institutional racism in the police service, and there were a large set of recommendations about how the police service should change.
So just before we leave the Blair government, the standing of Blair has been so coloured by the Iraq war. Did you feel that that unfairly has coloured the reputation of this of Labour's longest serving Prime Minister in history?
I think there have been a number of things that have resulted in that, but Iraq is definitely one of the major things that has contributed to that. I think it has taken away from the way that people remember the achievements of that government in that 13 years, definitely. 10 years, of course, under Tony.
You then became British High Commissioner in Australia in 2009, Britain's first black, unless I'm forgetting somebody, High Commissioner to Australia. How was that? Tell us about that experience. What did you manage to do in that job?
Well, I was in that job for a much shorter time than I anticipated when I went there, because when I went, I was hoping that I would be there for 4 years. Again, for me, it was another opportunity for a different kind of learning, a part of the world that I didn't know that well. I had been Minister for the Commonwealth when I was a Foreign Office Minister. So as part of the Commonwealth, I had a sense of Australia, New Zealand, also some of the countries in Asia, but my expertise was much more around Africa and the Caribbean. So I saw it as an opportunity to really understand and get much closer to some of the politics around China, for example, Southeast Asia, and the way that Australia itself was pivoting in terms of its foreign policy and looking to that part of the world, because that part of the world was very much its neighbourhood. In the end, I think I was only there, I was there for less than a year, because when the coalition government came in, one of the first things that they had to do was to make a recommendation to the Secretary General of the United Nations as to who they wanted to be the Under Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs. And I was asked if I was prepared to have my name put forward. I thought it was a very brave thing for that government to do. For the first kind of appointment they were making to, or recommendation they were making for an overseas role of this scale and size, to be somebody who had been a Labour cabinet minister and was sitting on the Labour benches in the House of Lords. The recommendation went through. I was interviewed by Ban Ki-moon, and I became, I was appointed and went to the UN.
And can I just remind at this point, all those listening do have questions coming through. University of Buckingham, of course, has founded, we're very proud of our UN Institute here, chaired by Mark Malloch-Brown, who you knew well from...
Oh, I know very well, yes.
I mean, suddenly this job, you have so much potential ability to make the world a better place. How do you begin to prioritize the difference you can make?
So it was the most amazing job, Anthony. Also the most exhausting job I have ever done. I describe it as you start with a full tank, and by the time you finish, your tank is completely run down, because of course crises were just proliferating around the world. And in this role, the job was to coordinate the UN agencies that worked on humanitarian response, be it UNICEF, dealing with children, be it working with the UNDP, the development agency, on the transition between humanitarian and development, be it the World Health Organization on the health aspects of it. So a whole range of major UN agencies, as well as the big international NGOs, your Oxfams, your Save the Children's, and others working in this area, and of course the national NGOs in the country in which you're working. And we were working in conflict zones. We were working on the response to natural disasters around the world, and these are major floods, for example, or earthquakes. But it's also working on what are called slow onset crises. These are things like famines, which take a while before they get to that really difficult point, and last for a long time, and can recur in parts of the world. So in a way, the crises almost prioritize themselves. And the key thing was to make sure that you didn't lose sight of the ones that hadn't gone away. We were dealing in situations in countries, for example, like the Democratic Republic of the Congo, which had gone on for years and years and years. If you think of Syria, Syria started in 2011, while I was at the UN, it is still going on today. And I think it's a real failure of our system, our international system, which is very much based on countries working together, very much based on the Security Council, looking at these major challenges to the world in terms of security, that we have not been able to get the agreement of nations, particularly the big powerful ones, because you'll have the US on one side and you'll have Russia on the other, you'll have the US on and Britain on one side and China on the other. The US, France, Britain on one side, China and Russia on the other, and really getting through the political difficulties that countries face in the way that they view these conflicts to actually come up with a roadmap and a way of tackling these crises that works for the people of those countries is something that really, really bothers me. So often I heard from people on the ground, we have been forgotten. And by that, they meant not enough has been done to try to resolve this problem to help our country to come out of it.
And Donald Trump, will he have inflicted lasting damage? This is obviously after you'd come back and you were, from 2015, the director at the School of Oriental and African Studies in London, SOAS. But do you think Trump will have inflicted long-term damage on the UN?
Oh, I think so. If you look at what's been happening just in the last few months in relation to the World Health Organization, if you look at the way that President Trump and his administration have treated the United Nations in relation to a number of not just crisis areas, but also the broader political agenda and the leadership that's needed. And if you have a country that essentially is saying, we don't need to work through these multilateral fora which that country helped to found, you have a major problem. The United States is extremely wealthy. It is one of the countries that historically has played an important role, and to see them walking away from so much that it's important that they're engaged with, I think has got to be a worry for all of us.
And changing political leaders in the UK also, David Cameron making way for Theresa May and the hostile environment. Was there a change in tone from prime ministers when she took over?
Oh, in relation to the global, do you mean? Yeah. There was certainly a difference in terms of our home environment, because if you look at it politically, what you would say is that David Cameron was tough on immigration in policy terms, but actually in terms of some of the equality issues that David Cameron was looking at, he had a much more open way of dealing with some of those issues than I think people necessarily expected. And even if you look at Theresa May and the race disparity unit that she established, again, a recognition of a major challenge. My argument with those successive governments is that it's fine to set up a race disparity audit. What are you doing with the recommendations when they are made? Are you implementing them? We have so many recommendations that are left unimplemented, sitting on the shelves of successive prime ministers. And so we get to today where we have our young people out on the streets, because as I said at the beginning, we have had a history, such a long history of inequality, discrimination, stereotyping, and it has come to a head. And the big thing that worries me, Anthony, is that because people like me are critical of the fact that we have not made progress, because our young people are out on the streets talking about their everyday experiences, we are somehow then challenged as people who don't believe in Britain. And that is something that I think is absolutely appalling. We are told, but you're living in a country which is tolerant, which actually allows you to be critical. You should be extremely grateful. We are part and parcel of Britain today. We are part and parcel of modern Britain. And to throw back at us that we have no right to be critical, we have no right to draw to the attention of our government the fact that there is significant inequality, that there is significant structural inequality that needs to be dealt with, is something that I take serious offence at.
So question, what would you most want to do if you were Prime Minister or advising Boris Johnson to make it fairer and better?
So I would start with education. You would expect me to say that. You know, my parents were teachers. I'm in higher education now, but I think that education is absolutely critical. And I think that an understanding of our history and how that history has informed our present and will continue to shape our future is something that we have to address. I think the inequalities in our criminal justice system, in the figures in terms of the disproportionate impact on Black young people, particularly Black young men, is something that we need to take extremely seriously. We can take it sector by sector, but there is also something that is even more important than that, because there is something that is deep-seated and cultural about the ways in which we relate to each other. And we have to tackle that, and we need leadership to enable us to do that. A leadership that has to be able to speak truthfully about the reality of the discrimination and making it absolutely clear that in seeking to address that discrimination, it is not about trying to take things away from others. It's about sharing the pie that we have more equally. And being able to do that takes strong leadership, it takes courage, and right now we haven't got that.
In the government?
I don't think we have that in our government, unfortunately.
Marie says, what are your thoughts about Black Lives Matter, and is it going to lead to a positive outcome because of all the urgency?
I hope it will lead to a positive outcome, but the only way it will lead to a positive outcome, in my view, is firstly, if we recognise that we have plenty of data, plenty of evidence that talks to the levels of discrimination that exist, and we start to take action. And I am concerned that what the Prime Minister has done yet again is to say that he's setting up another commission. We have recommendations from the report that David Lammy did 3 years ago into the criminal justice system that have still not been implemented. We have recommendations from the report that McGregor Smith did looking at workplace discrimination that have not been implemented. Let's get on and implement those recommendations and show that we mean business.
So next question here, and do keep the questions coming, is about whether universities should be positively discriminating in favour of the Black boys and girls who maybe have not had the same opportunities at school as some of the others. Should Oxford, should Buckingham, should all the others be positively discriminating in favour?
So one of the things that universities have been doing is looking at the achievements of young people in the round. So, for example, if they're looking at A-level results, they're saying these are the kinds of results that young people are getting in public school. If you have a 17, 18-year-old who has gone to school in, I don't know, Tottenham in London, or a part of the Northeast, or Liverpool or Manchester in the Northwest, and they have gone to a state school in a disadvantaged community, and that person gets 2 A's and a B as opposed to getting 3 A's. That is 3 A's in a public school. That is a huge achievement. So I really worry that the debate has become that our young people aren't good enough. It is not that our young people aren't good enough. I think they are doing extraordinary things, given many of the difficulties and the disadvantages that they have to face. The system has to change to recognise that and to accommodate that. I don't see that as positive discrimination. I see that as recognising that young people who come from a background where they have not been as advantaged as others are doing extraordinary things, and that should be recognised.
And Mark asks, for yourself, Valerie, how did you yourself overcome the great, even greater restrictions on your own progress as a woman of colour in your career, and what are the lessons that you would give to Black girls and more generally across the BAME community today?
There are a number of things I would say. I think you have to work hard. I don't think you get anywhere really without working extremely hard. I think it's very important to get support. I've always been supported by my family, by people around me. You need to have somewhere to go when things look extraordinarily difficult. I think being clear about what you care about and why, and what you want to be able to do with your life is very important. Being clear about what you don't like and what you don't want to do is also good. Having courage, being able to take risks. That's not always an easy thing to do because we have others around us that we are supporting. But know what your risk appetite is. I also think that it's important to be your own self. Now, this is perhaps the hardest thing to do. There's a big discussion about, for example, can you bring your authentic self into the workplace, for example. That is not always possible. And I don't know the extent to which any of us brings the whole of ourselves into the workplace. But there is something about the ability to feel that you are not having to repress a core part of you, which is something that is deeply, deeply corrosive, and I think goes on far too much. And it goes on for women, and I've seen that change over time, and it goes on for Black people and people of colour. And that, which is essentially about the culture of the organisation, the institution that you're working in, is something which needs a lot more work. Can we really engage with each other in an honest way? Can you actually challenge a colleague, tell them that you don't like what they're saying? Can colleagues around you do the same kind of challenge without somebody suddenly becoming defensive and thinking that you're accusing them of racism? And even if you are, is there a space that enables you to have that conversation, to understand why they're asking you to think about what you've said, how you've behaved. There's far too much of this behavior, and it's day-to-day behavior that goes on all the time that can make it so difficult to actually wake up in the morning, get dressed, and say that you're going to work, because you could be facing yet another day where hour after hour things will be said. There will be behaviors that aren't being challenged by anyone that are undermining your very being. And we have to be much more conscious of this than we are.
This is all very timely. The University of Buckingham has an open forum on these very issues tomorrow. I hope everyone listening is going to take part of that. Earl, the questions are now coming in fast and thick. Earl says, I'm black, but I'm concerned about some playing the race card because they didn't get something, which then dilutes the racism issue. How can we combat this?
Well, I have to say that if there are people who do that, I think it's a tiny minority. And I think far too often that is used as a reason for workplaces or an educational establishment or a school not changing its behavior. I have worked in this area for a very long time, and I have to say that if I were to identify people who I felt had done that, it would be a handful. So it's not something that I want to focus on.
Next question is, why have successive governments not done more to implement recommendations of the various reports, including the David Lammy report 3 years ago?
I don't know, is the short answer, because I think that government should be throwing resources at this, to be perfectly honest. But I think underneath all of that, there has to be some kind of sense that they can get away with not implementing those recommendations, thinking that these are issues that are not important enough, for example. That has to be a part of it.
Quick question. Danielle says, have you been back to Guyana, and are you treated as a very famous person there? do they all know what you've achieved?
I have been back to Guyana many times, and I was hoping to go again later this year, but I think COVID-19 has put paid to that. And yes, I am treated very well when I go to Guyana. People are very proud of me there.
And two questions on the UN, thoughts on achieving the development goals, and Hongbo says, should it be urgently reformed to become more representative of countries at large rather than just those few mega powerful ones?
So I think in today's world, and particularly with climate change having been so much at the top of our agenda, and I think COVID-19 has made us really reflect on the world that we are living in, and I hope we will grasp this moment. I don't know if we will, but I hope we will grasp this moment. I think as a result of that, although not everybody knows about the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, I do think that it gives us an opportunity and a moment when we can really understand the importance of those goals and redouble our efforts to achieve them. 2030 is not that long away, which is when we say we want to achieve those goals. Should we reform the United Nations? Of course, it's an organization that needs reform. There's no organization that can stay static, and the UN has changed and developed over time, added issues to its agenda. But the big bit of the reform, which is around the Security Council, which has 5 permanent members, reflecting the way the world looked back then when the UN was formed rather than now, that is the hard bit, and that is the bit that urgently needs reform, because it needs to reflect where the world is now. China, Russia, the United States, the United Kingdom, France are the countries which are currently the permanent members of the Security Council. Those are not the only countries that are wielding significant influence in the world today. What of India, for example? There are no countries on the African continent: Nigeria, South Africa, Kenya. What of countries in Latin America? Your Brazils, your Argentinas. So there are regions in the world, not just countries, which aren't represented on the Security Council in the sense of being permanent members. And you have a rotating on a 2-year basis the other 10, but it's not good enough.
Sadly, we're going to have to end it there. Apologies to the questioners who haven't had their questions asked. I feel very bad about that, but thank you for sending them anyway. And just before we go, I always ask people about the room in which they're in. Where are you, Valerie, talking from now?
So I'm in London. I'm actually sitting at my dining table, which has become my office now that I'm working from home. And behind me, I hope you can see it, I have a wonderful South African pot, which I treasure, which was made by a very famous South African potter, as well as my orchids. I have to have flowers.
Quite right too. Well, Valerie, Amos, I mean, what an incredible treat, and we all wish you the very best of good fortune at Oxford. Very pleased you're only 15 miles down the road from us here in Buckingham, and from our very considerable audience who've heard such wisdom and such eloquence and such good sense from someone who has truly had a life well lived, and who I'm sure will go on and achieve extraordinary things in the future. We have been very blessed and very fortunate to listen to you and to spend an hour in your company. Thank you, Valerie, very, very much from all of us, and farewell.
Thank you. Take care.